Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to unravel one of the most iconic and perplexing paintings of the 20th century, Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory. And you've clearly got a real fascination with this one. Judging by the stack of articles and research you've sent over to us, it's more than just melting clocks, isn't it? There's something about this piece that just draws you in.
Absolutely. And you're right, there's so much more beneath the surface. Even if you've only seen it in passing, that image of those melting clocks in a strange, almost barren landscape, it sticks with you.
It really does. In your research, there's this one detail that really stood out to me. The central figure, that fleshy, almost slug-like form. What is Dali doing with that? It's unsettling, yet I can't stop looking at it.
It's a fascinating element and definitely key to unlocking the painting's deeper meaning. A lot of scholars see it as a self-portrait, but a distorted one. Dali seemed obsessed with this idea of decay, things breaking down even the human form.
And that's where those melting clocks come in, right? They're not just random. They're almost like a visual metaphor for this idea of time as something fluid, something that can deteriorate.
Precisely. And Dali himself actually referred to them as the camembert of time. Think about the texture of camembert, soft, almost runny. It's not a coincidence. He's playing with our perception of time as something rigid, something we can measure and control.
Okay, that's a brilliant connection.
Mm.
So the clocks in the figure are linked by this theme of decay, of things losing their solidity. But why ants? I see in my notes they're swarming over that gold pocket watch. It's almost repulsive.
Dali was fascinated by ants, and in his work, they consistently represent decay and death. Think about what ants do. They break things down, consume them. By placing them on the watch, he's amplifying this sense of time as something that's not just fluid, but also vulnerable to being devoured, consumed by the very forces of nature it's supposed to govern.
It's almost like he's saying time itself is subject to death, which is a pretty mind-blowing concept.
Right.
But is it just about decay? I have a note here about this strange dreamlike quality to the whole piece.
You're picking up on something crucial there. The landscape, the melting forms, it all evokes a sense of the irrational escapation. The subconscious. Dali was heavily influenced by Freud and the idea of dreams as a window into our deepest desires and anxieties.
So he's not just painting a scene, he's painting a dreamscape.
Yeah.
But why choose these specific elements? Why clocks, ants, and whatever that fleshy thing is supposed to be?
This is where Dali's paranoid critical method comes in. Now, that might sound like a mouthful, but it's essentially his technique for tapping into his subconscious to fuel his art. Imagine him staring at objects for hours, inducing a state of almost hallucinatory perception until they transform into something else entirely.
So those clocks, the ants, they're almost like visual representations of his own subconscious fears and obsessions taking shape. It's both fascinating and a little disturbing.
Exactly, and it's not entirely random. There's a note you have here about a possible connection to Hieronymus Bosch, that 16th century painter known for his incredibly bizarre and fantastical imagery. Apparently, there's a figure hidden amongst the rocks and creatures in Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights that bears a striking resemblance to Dali's melting face.
Wait, you're saying Dali might have been consciously or unconsciously channeling a painter from over 4 centuries ago?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Ah.
But what does it tell us about the persistence of memory?
It speaks to Dali's deep understanding of art history and his ability to draw connections across time. He's weaving together threads of symbolism, personal anxieties, and even historical references to create this tapestry of meaning. And that's what makes this painting so endlessly fascinating. It's not just a visual spectacle, it's a puzzle box waiting to be unlocked.
You've definitely got me hooked. So we have these melting clocks, this fleshy, almost self-portrait-like figure, a connection to Bosch. Like every element is layered with meaning. But there's still this question of the landscape itself. It's a desolate, almost apocalyptic. What's Dali doing with that?
That's where we need to delve into Dali's own personal history, his connection to the Catalan coast, and the way he used landscapes to reflect his inner world. And perhaps even a hint of foreshadowing of the turbulent times to come. But that, my friend, is a story for part 2 of our deep dive. That desolate landscape you mentioned, it's not just some random backdrop. Dali was deeply connected to his homeland, the Catalan coast of Spain, those cliffs in the distance. They're actually inspired by the real landscape near his childhood home.
So even in this dreamscape, there's a grounding in reality. It's like he's blending the familiar with the utterly bizarre. I'm looking at my notes, and there's this quote from Dali about the landscape that inspired the painting. He describes seeing a specific olive tree bathed in this melancholy twilight. It's almost poetic.
He was a master of creating this unsettling beauty, wasn't he? And that melancholy, that sense of unease, it's a thread that runs through so much of his work. Some scholars even see it as a premonition of the political and social upheavals that were brewing in Europe at the time.
That's interesting. So the landscape is not just a personal reflection, but perhaps a reflection of the anxieties of an entire era.
Exactly. And if we connect that to the melting figure, which we were discussing earlier, it adds another layer to the idea of decay and instability. Remember, many believe that figure is a distorted self-portrait.
Right, and we were about to dive into the possible connections to sexuality and Freudian symbolism. There's a lot in my notes about that.
Well, Dali was both fascinated and repelled by sexuality. He had a very strict Catholic upbringing, and his own personal life was complicated, to say the least.
There's definitely a certain tension there. On one hand, he was deliberately provocative, almost flaunting his eccentricities. But then you read his writings and there's this underlying anxiety, a darkness.
Absolutely. And that tension is what makes his work so compelling. It's not just shocking for the sake of being shocking. There's a depth to it, a grappling with these primal forces that we all experience: desire, fear, the inevitability of death.
And maybe that's what he's getting at with that melting figure. It's not just a self-portrait. It's a representation of the human condition, vulnerable, exposed, ultimately subject to the same forces of decay as those clocks.
That's a really insightful observation, and it brings us back to that crucial element: Dali's paranoid critical method. We talked about it briefly before, but it's worth exploring further. It wasn't just some artistic gimmick. It was his way of accessing a deeper truth, a reality beyond the rational.
So it wasn't just about inducing hallucinations. It was about using those hallucinations to tap into something more profound. I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Think of it this way. Dali believed that our rational mind is constantly filtering and censoring our perceptions. By deliberately disrupting that process, he could tap into a more primal, instinctual level of awareness.
And that's where the truly surreal images came from. The melting clocks, the ants, that strange, almost sexualized figure.
Exactly. He wasn't just painting what he saw. He was painting what he felt, what he feared, what he desired. And by doing so, he created a visual language that speaks to something universal in the human experience.
It's like he's giving us a glimpse into his own subconscious, but in a way that resonates with our own hidden fears and desires.
Yeah.
No wonder this painting has such a lasting impact.
And it's not just the imagery itself. It's the technical skill, the way he blends those surreal elements with an almost hyper-realistic style. Look at the way he renders the textures, the light and shadow. It's masterful.
It's that juxtaposition that gets me. The irrational and the meticulously crafted. It's both disturbing and beautiful at the same time. It's like he's saying, look, even chaos could be beautiful.
And that's a powerful message, isn't it? Especially in a world that often feels increasingly chaotic and unpredictable.
Absolutely. It's like he's giving us permission to embrace the irrational, to find beauty in the unexpected. But there's one thing I'm still struggling with.
What's that?
We've talked about decay, sexuality, the subconscious. But what about time itself? What is Dali ultimately saying about time in the persistence of memory?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer that, we need to go beyond the melting clocks themselves. We need to look at Dali's evolving understanding of science, specifically his fascination with atomic physics and the nature of reality itself. And that brings us to a later painting that you have in your research, the disintegration of the persistence of memory.
Okay, so we're going from melting clocks to disintegration. This is getting more intense by the minute.
It is, and it's in that later work where we see Dali grappling with some truly mind-bending concepts. But that's a story for part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready to have my mind blown. What is this about the disintegration of the persistence of memory in atomic physics?
Well, in the 1950s, the world was reeling from these discoveries of atomic fission and the devastating power of the atomic bomb. Dali, always a man tuned into the currents of his time, became absolutely captivated by these new scientific revelations. He even started devouring scientific journals, immersing himself in the world of particles and quantum mechanics.
So he wasn't just dabbling. He was seriously engaging with these complex scientific ideas.
He was. And it completely transformed his art. In disintegration, those melting clocks from the persistence of memory are back. But they're not just melting anymore, they're literally breaking apart, fragmenting into these rectangular blocks and almost missile-like shapes.
It's like he's taking that concept of time as fluid and pushing it to the extreme. If persistence was about the subjective nature of time, disintegration feels almost apocalyptic, like time itself is being shattered.
Exactly. In those fragmented forms, they're actually visual representations of atomic particles, the building blocks of matter itself. Dali is suggesting that even time, something we perceive as constant and linear, can be broken down into these tiny invisible components.
It's like he's saying that with the discovery of the atom, our whole understanding of reality has been shattered, even our understanding of time. It's kind of terrifying, but also incredibly exciting.
He even called himself a nuclear mystic, which perfectly captures that blend of scientific curiosity and almost spiritual awe he felt in the face of these discoveries.
So how does this all connect back to the persistence of memory? To change how we should interpret that earlier work?
It definitely adds a new layer of depth to those melting clocks. They're not just about the dreamlike fluidity of time, they also foreshadow this deeper understanding of time as something that can be broken down, fragmented, even potentially destroyed.
It's almost prophetic. He painted persistence years before the atomic bomb was even a reality. Yet there's this sense of foreboding, this premonition of a world on the brink of some fundamental change.
And that's the power of Dali's art. It speaks to these universal anxieties, not just about time, but about the nature of reality itself. He makes us question our assumptions, forces us to confront the fragility of the world we think we know.
This has been an incredible journey. We've gone from melting cheese to ants, from Freudian symbolism to atomic physics. It's like peeling back layers of an onion, and with each layer, the painting becomes even more fascinating and complex.
And there's still so much we can unpack. The symbolism of the olive tree, the possible connections to Dali's personal relationships. But I think the most important takeaway is this. The persistence of memory is not just a pretty picture. It's a portal into the mind of a genius. A man who was wrestling with the biggest questions of his time. The nature of time, the fragility of reality, the power of the subconscious.
And it's a testament to the enduring power of art. This painting, created almost a century ago, still has the power to provoke us, to challenge us, to make us look at the world with fresh eyes.
So the next time you glance at a clock, don't just see a timekeeping device. See a symbol of the fluidity of time, the fragility of our perceptions, and the boundless mysteries of the universe.
That's a perfect note to end on. A huge thanks to you for joining us for this deep dive, and to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those clocks melting.